By July 1942, a glimmer of light appeared to be on the horizon. For although the situation was still worsening in Europe, the Atlantic, North Africa, and Southeast Asia, in the Pacific theater, the war was turning in favor of the Allies. It was not going to be long before they switched from the defensive to the offensive. However, the main debate at the time in the Allied camp, one that had been growing in intensity, was the question of the invasion of Europe.
The beach and port area of Dieppe were chosen for a trial landing on the enemy-held coastline. Canadian troops were chosen for the job, codenamed Jubilee. It was a disaster. Hundreds of troops were killed as soon as they landed on the beaches, their bodies strewn along the shore. Those who weren't killed were rapidly taken prisoner. In the Mediterranean, Malta continued to hold out. It suffered endless bombardment from sea and air, and in April 1942 alone, almost 10,000 enemy sorties were flown against the island. Churchill was increasingly concerned about lack of progress in the desert campaign and decided to visit the Eighth Army in Egypt to see for himself. He felt a change of leadership was now vital, and General Alexander was given overall command in the Middle East. General Gott was appointed to lead the Eighth Army, but was suddenly killed in an air crash. They urgently needed someone to take his place. General Bernard Montgomery was the man. Monty, as he was immediately nicknamed, very soon impressed his dynamic personality on his men. There will be no more withdrawals, he told them, simply. It was the message they had been waiting for. The British knew from their cracking of Germany's secret code that Rommel was preparing to attack. And in fact, he moved at the end of August, thrusting towards Cairo and ultimately to the Suez Canal. Monty then set about preparing the Eighth Army for a decisive blow against the Afrika Korps. This finally began on the night of October the 23rd, the Battle of El Alamein. The Battle of Alamein began in the evening. In the growing dusk, the final positions were taken up. At 0-30, the barrage began. Then the Allied infantry advanced on a frontal attack towards the Axis lines. British, Australians, New Zealanders. Many people believed that it was all over in a day, but in fact, it took 11 days to finally break through, and Montgomery's men began the 800-mile advance along the coastal strip of the Egyptian and Libyan desert, through towns whose names had become familiar not only to the soldiers who had advanced and retreated through them time and time again during the last 2 years, but even to the errand boys, housewives, and music hall comedians of Britain. Tobruk, Benghazi, Bardia, Sidi Barrani, Derna, Tripoli. There was still much fighting to be done before the Axis armies were finally driven from North Africa. Large amounts of German prisoners fell into Allied hands. The end of the battle saw Rommel's Afrika Korps totally broken. It was a vital victory for the Allies. As Churchill said, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." The war was stepping up in Europe too, particularly in the air. In spring, the Avro Lancaster bomber came on stream, destined to become one of the most effective bombers of the war. Churchill believed that failing a second front, the only direct way that Britain could help reduce the German pressure on Russia was through her bomber command. In February 1942, Bomber Command obtained a new chief, the blunt-speaking Arthur Harris, destined to be known as Bomber Harris. He believed in the principle of area bombing. By this means, he expected that the Germans would be beaten without the need for great losses in lives resulting from ground attack alone. During World War II, almost 750,000 tons of bombs were dropped on German targets. In spite of the attacks, the German army was still on the move on the Russian front, heading for the town of Stalingrad. For Stalin, the town that bore his name must be held at all costs. The civilian population was hastily evacuated. The troops must be able to defend it without hindrance. Now began one of the most intense and lengthy battles of World War II. As they reached the city, the Germans met with ferocious resistance. Every attack was met with counterattack. Every quarter, every street was fought for. As the November days went by, the city was gradually reduced to ruins. By the 19th, the Red Army was being reinforced with fresh troops and began an encircling movement around the city, though still continuing to fight within. A few days later, the encirclement was successfully completed. The German commander, General Paulus, found himself suddenly cut off inside the city with 330,000 troops, separated from the rest of the German army by an unbridgeable gap of 50 miles. The battle for the city still went on throughout December and January. At the end of January, Göring broadcast to the people that Stalingrad must be regarded as a symbol of Germans' unconquerable will to win. General Paulus, too, declared to Hitler that he would never surrender, and he was immediately promoted to Field Marshal. But by now, his army was trapped inside two rapidly reducing pockets inside the city. Within a day of his guarantee to Hitler, Paulus surrendered the first of the pockets. And 2 days later, on the 2nd of February, the other pocket surrendered as well. Stalingrad was a triumph for the Russian army, and its first real victory. The Germans lost 90,000 men at Stalingrad. An even larger number, 110,000, were taken as prisoners of war. The battle for Stalingrad was the turning point of the war on the Russian front. Yet Hitler was still determined to conquer the Russians. With that object in mind, he began by mounting a limited but defined offensive in the spring. The Russians had created a salient in the German lines near Kursk. Hitler decided to pincer the salient and cut it off. The Germans assembled one of their greatest array of tanks. At 2 in the afternoon of July the 5th, the Germans launched their first wave of 2,000 tanks. By the end of that day, they had lost 200 of them and the staggering figure of 25,000 men. The Battle of the Giants raged for a week, and on the blazing summer morning of July the 12th, two armies closed for the most terrible armored encounter of all times, in which they constantly met head-on. By the end of the day, it was over, and more than half the tanks had been annihilated. Burning wrecks, not even fit for scrap metal. Kursk was a total triumph of Soviet arms. After that battle, the Germans were never to advance again on the Eastern Front. Even on the Asia fronts, the situation for the Allies was more than holding. The U.S. General Stilwell, known to his men as Vinegar Joe, had been training the Chinese troops in Burma for attack. Some 13,000 Chinese had been flown across the Himalayas as reinforcements from China. Last year, Stilwell had claimed, "I tell you, we took a hell of a beating." Now, he was ready to retaliate. His British counterpart was General Ord Wingate, a highly charismatic character who had vigorously promoted the belief that the Japanese could be beaten in jungle conditions. His specially trained men, known as the Chindits, were ready to carry out one of the most audacious operations of the Burma campaign. 10,000 of his Chindits were to be flown by glider along with their equipment, including 1,000 pack mules, bulldozers, and 25-pounder guns, into clearings in the jungle, right, as he put it, into the guts of the enemy, some hundreds of miles away, across an 8,000-foot-high mountain barrier. The glider force was under the command of Bill Cochran, and there could be no fighter escort for them. The operation was a complete success. Everything depended on the element of surprise, and for the enemy there was to be plenty of that. Anglo-American combined operations was increasing on every front. Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed that the defeat of Germany would take precedence over that of Japan. General Eisenhower was put in charge of the first of their combined operations, to take place in the Mediterranean theater of war. The object, to finally clear North Africa of Axis troops. It had begun on November the 8th, codenamed Torch, with combined amphibious landings in the west on the Moroccan coast, and was a success. Meantime, Montgomery's 8th Army was entering Tunisia from the east. Rommel prepared to throw his full forces against his old adversary, Montgomery. In early March 1943, Monty inflicted heavy damage on the German tanks, and Rommel left North Africa a sick man.
The end of January 1943 presented the Allies with a much different situation from that of 12 months previously. The Axis powers had been exerting pressure on all fronts, but the world situation was changing. With two resounding Allied successes at Stalingrad and El Alamein, the war reached a turning point, although the path that lay ahead had many steep and treacherous sections. The Allies knew that it was the path that would eventually lead them to final victory.
The time had come at last for the Western Allies to set foot in Europe for the first time. The British and US forces landed on the island of Sicily on the 10th of July. Not the long-called-for Second Front, exactly. That was to wait for yet a further year. But a vital prelude by attacking the so-called underbelly of occupied Europe. The operation went off absolutely according to plan. For the Italians, the loss of Sicily was the last straw. They deposed their once great leader, Duce Benito Mussolini. In Italy itself, the Allies chose Salerno, south of Naples, to obtain a strategic foothold. They extended their beachhead there and landed reinforcements in spite of considerable German resistance. Italy decided now not just to quit the war, but actually to change sides, and her fleet sailed to Malta, the George Cross Island, to surrender. Across the world, the struggle continued for the mastery of the Pacific. Progress for the Allies was still painfully slow through the almost impenetrable jungle of New Guinea. And in the Pacific island of New Britain, the Japanese held out in the face of American landings at the start of December 1943. It was another 4 months before they withdrew their forces further inland. In India, about the same time, in the spring of 1944, the Japanese besieged the town of Kohima and cut the supply road from Imphal. The British troops were hemmed into a narrow ring, and the small garrison lay under a murderous barrage of Japanese fire from the heights above the town, which blasted away the trees and bushes. All land routes to the besieged 14th Army were cut. The surrounding hills could provide no landing grounds for supply aircraft. Every day, American pilots flew 300 sorties through a storm of shells to drop their urgent cargo, and their dropping area became smaller and harder to target as the Japanese squeezed in on the surviving troops. No member of the garrison slept longer than 2 hours. Medical supplies were all but non-existent. The only water lay within a few yards of Japanese gunfire. But the garrison held. They didn't realize it at the time, but Generals Slim and Mountbatten had organized the reinforcements that were about to lift the siege and turn the tide.
The day of victory was getting nearer for the Allies. The British and American bombers were pounding Germany from the air. Brave sailors ran the gauntlet of the U-boat packs in the Atlantic. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had cracked the once invincible German panzers in the greatest tank battle in history at Kursk. They then pressed on to give Hitler a harsh lesson in his own blitzkrieg tactics. The Afrika Corps had been driven out of North Africa. Italy had been invaded and Mussolini was deposed. All of this provided the backdrop for what was to be the greatest assault of the war, Operation Overlord, D-Day.
It was the news that all the people of the free world had been waiting for months. Yet, when it came, it seemed unbelievable. The Allied troops were on the shores of France. The Allies thrust south from Caen to Falaise to cut off the withdrawing German forces. A pincer movement developed, and it took the Allied forces more than a week of intense fighting before they were able to overcome German resistance and close the gap. August the 16th, 1944. On the march at last. The British had relieved their besieged garrison at Kohima, and all were moving north now to meet the rest of the relieving forces. They found the hillsides and the villages of battered bungalows and gardens covered with enemy dead. The Japanese strength here was now spent. The tide of aggression had begun to ebb. The monsoons broke again. It was all the British troops could do to keep on their tails. 8 miles a day at best were all they could achieve in this atrocious weather. By the middle of September, contact with the enemy became more frequent. The men were now so hardened and acclimatized, they were beginning to ignore the lesser discomforts. Supplies could only be obtained from the air. They began with hit-and-miss drops to isolated garrisons. But gradually, things became properly organized through Eastern Air Command. Somebody put it that the Army of the Jungle advanced on the wings of the Air Force. In the Pacific, a similar claim might have been made, that the fleets of the ocean advanced on the wings of their Air Force. The Americans had made great advances in that ocean and were sailing in the region of the Mariana Islands. In the air battles that took place above, the Japanese lost no less than 219 aircraft against the Americans' 29, and American submarines sank 2 Japanese aircraft carriers. On the following day, the American aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet again and sank another carrier, as well as more Japanese aircraft. The Japanese losses reached such proportions that the US pilots called this battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On the Italian front, however, the American forces weren't enjoying the same degree of success. The Germans were setting up strongly defended lines across the Italian peninsula, against which the Allies made little or no progress. What is more, winter was setting in rather sharply this year, and the Allied troops were becoming fatigued and losing momentum. They were also aware that the spotlight of popular attention was shining more brightly on the successes of the Allies in France. Paris, at the beginning of August 1944, things were stirring. For some days now, some Germans had started leaving the city. Not the soldiers, but their civilian officials. Next day, the Gestapo left. That same day, a police car opened fire on a German detachment on the Place de la Concorde. Then, scuffles broke out, and suddenly the tricolour was flying from every window. The city was full of excitement, expectation. Not even German soldiers around now. Suddenly, from the outskirts of the city, shouting could be heard. The rumor was going around everywhere. The French army was on the road into the city. The rumor soon proved true. It was the French army. Paris was liberated. It belonged to the people again. A few days later, it was the same in Belgium. The citizens of Brussels were laughing and crying as the Tommies came rolling in tanks. The people could hardly believe it. They were free. Montgomery was now aiming for Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. The 1st British Airborne Division was now given the task of taking the bridges over the Dutch stretch of the Rhine at Arnhem. It began well enough, but German resistance proved far greater than anticipated, and supplies to the British were delayed. The operation ended in disaster, as the British troops were cut off and more than 7,000 men were taken prisoner, wounded, or killed. For the troops in Burma, December the 7th, 1944 was a great day. They were once again looking down on the old Chindwin River, at the very place where 2.5 years ago they had crossed it in retreat. They had even buried guns on the far bank at that time, and they wondered whether they were still there. The big task now was to get a bridge across that river. In the Pacific, the Americans had built giant airstrips on the Marianas. At the end of November, over 100 B-29s attacked the aero engine factories outside Tokyo. The sustained air offensive against the Japanese homeland had begun. In Europe, things were slowing down a little with the start of winter. Still, they had now reached the Belgian Ardennes. The German border was now barely a dozen miles away. And then, all hell broke loose. Hitler had decided to throw in everything he'd got in one last desperate gamble to turn the tide. His generals stopped the Americans in their tracks. The US troops were stunned, as was the rest of the Allied world at the news. The Germans were taking American soldiers as prisoners in their thousands. The Americans hadn't known anything like it before. Because of foggy weather, the US Air Force was grounded, and couldn't provide their troops with air coordination until suddenly, on Christmas Eve, the fog lifted, and the Americans went back on the attack again. The Germans had shot their last bolt.
But the German army fought on stubbornly. Their attack through the Ardennes to fight the Battle of the Bulge was a last desperate gamble. With its failure, the Avengers closed in on a Reich which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years.
The US Army was on the march again and made the first crossing of the German border in spite of every effort the Germans made to keep them off German soil. German cities were being reduced to rubble. The factories of the industrial Ruhr region were hammered incessantly. In the air, Anglo-American aircraft were bombing round the clock, the RAF by night, the US Air Force by day. The transportation systems, roads, rail, bridges were being cut, along with the trucks and trains and barges carrying war material. Bombing of the refineries caused a serious shortage of fuel for the army vehicles, tanks, and Luftwaffe aircraft. And now, in the Pacific, the picture was the same.
From the moment it failed to achieve a total victory at Pearl Harbor, defeat was inevitable for Japan. But turning inevitability into reality was to take a heavy toll in human lives, for the Japanese were the most tenacious fighters. The Allies faced death on the beaches of palm-fringed islands, in the steaming jungles, in the vastness of the Pacific, and in the horrendous prison camps. When General MacArthur left the Philippines, he vowed, "I shall return." He did so in a spectacular campaign of island hopping.
For General MacArthur himself, it was an emotional moment to be able to step ashore again on the Philippines and honor his vow of 2 years before that he would return. As the months of early 45 wore on, the B-29s continued their high-altitude attacks. The first of the concentrated attacks on Tokyo took place on the night of the 9th and 10th of March. The results were devastating. 2 square miles of the city being totally destroyed. Attacks on other Japanese cities followed.
Land, at sea, and in the air, the Japanese were staring defeat in the face. They were driven to desperate measures, suicide attacks. But even the banzai charges and kamikaze raids could not stave off the Allied advances. The sun was rapidly going down for the Empire of Japan.
All pilots were volunteers for what was regarded as the ultimate honor, to die in battle for the Emperor. In the end, it wasn't going to win the war, but over the coming months, they were to damage or destroy many warships of the US Navy. The next target for the US forces was the island of Iwo Jima. The Japanese had turned this small volcanic island into a veritable fortress. It took weeks of air and naval bombardment before the US Marines were able to risk a landing. The Marines finally beached on February the 19th, and by nightfall they had landed 30,000 men. It took another month before Iwo Jima was fully secured, at the cost of 25,000 American casualties and 20,000 Japanese killed. The island of Okinawa was the final step in the island-by-island advance towards Japan itself. 50,000 American troops made their first landing at the start of April. But the battle to capture the island was to last for another 3 months.
In Burma, the forgotten 14th Army under General Sir William Slim beat the Japanese at their own game of jungle warfare.
In Burma, the campaign was going slowly but surely ahead. The 4th and 23rd Army Corps linked up on the plains before the Irrawaddy River in the early part of 1945. A very valuable prize now lay across the river: Mandalay. This objective was considerably helped by the completion of the new Lido Road linked to the old Burma Road. It had been carved through jungle and swamp, flooded gorges and mountain slopes. Every inch of the way was a struggle against nature. But the supply route to China was now once again open, and the first great convoy wound its way across the hills into China at the end of January 45. The troops crossed the Irrawaddy to take the immortal road to Mandalay. But the Japanese were well entrenched in its pagodas and among its shrines, and now had to be driven out. Beyond the hill lay Fort Dufferin, its massive walls protected by a wide moat. The RAF led the combined attack on this last enemy stronghold before Rangoon. On the 20th of March, the walls were finally breached, and Mandalay became once more a free city. Meantime, shortly after the surrender of Germany, Stalin had agreed at a meeting at Yalta in the Crimea to enter the war against Japan. The Western Allies had one big obstacle yet to overcome: the crossing of the River Rhine. They knew that the Germans would blow up all the bridges, and that would mean the problem of amphibious crossings under fire, almost like a mini D-Day. And then, on the 7th of March, they saw an astonishing sight. At the town of Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge was still intact. They couldn't believe their eyes or luck. Someone in the German command had seriously blundered. The US 9th promptly seized it, and by the end of the day, 8,000 troops had managed to cross the Rhine. For the next 10 days, the Germans tried to destroy the bridge without success. Meanwhile, US engineers began constructing temporary bridges of their own across other stretches of the river. As they pushed on deeper into Germany through blazing villages, the Allied troops found they seldom came across German soldiers, just mainly civilians and occasional refugees, till they came to what all of them described as the most sickening moment of their entire battle experience. the concentration and death camps. The names have become only too well known. The most famous or infamous: Dachau, Treblinka, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and here, Bergen-Belsen. And too many others to mention. As one man said,
"If there's anybody left who wonders if this war was worth fighting, well, I wish they could have been along."
Towards the end of April 1945, Western Germany was virtually overrun from north to south. French and American troops had reached the Danube. General Patton's 3rd U.S. Army had crossed the Czech border. The Western Allies were advancing on the River Elbe. From the east, by the 6th of April, the Russians were at the gates of Vienna. Hitler ordered that the city, which his troops had taken into the Reich just 7 years before without a shot being fired, must now be defended to the last drop of German blood. A week later, the Russians stormed the Schönbrunn Palace, and Austria's capital finally fell to the Soviet troops. Now they began to advance on their next capital city, Czechoslovakia's capital of Prague. This too was rapidly taken, and Stalin now turned his full attention on the most prized of them all, Berlin. At 3 in the morning on the 16th of April, 16,000 Russian rocket launchers, guns and mortars opened fire on the German defenses to the east of the city. The Red Air Force added weight to the barrage. Hitler vowed he would stay in his capital to the end. It was hard to believe this aging, almost pathetic figure was the same man who only a mere 3 years before ruled over half of Europe. A week earlier was the last time that another national leader was ever to make an appearance. On the 12th of April, FDR, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, died. Before the month was out, a third one-time national leader also made his last appearance in public, shot by his own countrymen who now reviled him. Benito Mussolini, hanging by his ankles upside down in a central square in Milan. On the banks of the River Elbe at the small town of Torgau, while the Russians were still fighting for Berlin, some of their divisions bypassed the city, heading west to meet up with their allies pushing east. The Russians were still fighting for Berlin. They finally stormed the German parliament building, the Reichstag. Days of intense street fighting still went on, and it was by one of those extraordinary symbolic coincidences that the Soviet army was able to hoist the red flag in the center of the enemy capital stronghold of Berlin on May Day, May the 1st, one of the most important days in the Soviet calendar. In Italy, meanwhile, the war was all but forgotten. Senior SS officers there had already opened negotiations with the Allies, realizing that defeat was staring them in the face. German officers signed an unconditional surrender on the spot, without any reference to Berlin, and the armistice there came into effect on May the 2nd.
Lüneburg Heath, Germany, May the 4th, 1945. The instrument of Germany's unconditional surrender was signed. Said Monty, "If you don't agree, I shall go on with the war and be delighted to do so." But the Germans sat down, and having read out the terms of capitulation, Field Marshal Montgomery gave his orders.
The German delegation will now sign this paper, and they will sign in order of seniority, and General Admiral von Friedeberg will sign first. Now, General Kinsall will sign next. Now, I will sign the instrument on behalf of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. But in the interest of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded along all the fronts. The German war is therefore at an end. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day.
Sardines had nothing on the crowds in Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly. A man we seem to have seen before somewhere looks down from a balcony in Whitehall. Given the freedom of London, fated in Paris, and now Washington and New York, America goes wild over a farmer's son from Kansas, General Ike. Outside Hitler's air raid shelter at the Chancellery is the spot where the bodies of Hitler and his alleged wife, Eva Braun, were said to have been burned. An SS man says he saw the bodies soaked in petrol and watched them burn.
From his bunker in Berlin, a shattered and ailing Führer directed imaginary armies until even he realized it was all over and committed suicide. His body was soaked in petrol and burned, a fitting end for the man who had plunged the world into flames. Across on the other side of the globe, the Japanese were also suffering their own punishment by inferno.
The island of Okinawa, the last Japanese defenders took refuge in cliff-top caves and had to be literally blasted out. Some Japanese even threw themselves off cliffs rather than suffer the indignity of surrender. This fanaticism boded ill for the invasion of Japan. On the 17th of July, an Allied conference convened at Potsdam, south of Berlin. All the heads of state were to attend, and there was a new face. Harry Truman was now President of the USA since the death of Roosevelt. Very soon, there was to be another new face. In the middle of the discussions, Prime Minister Churchill had to leave the conference and return to Britain to hear the results of the British general election. Everyone in Britain acknowledged the enormous and indispensable contribution made by Winston Churchill to the war effort. But a deep and often unexpressed feeling had been developing, especially among the young service personnel, that a different sort of government was going to be needed in the post-war world. And so Churchill arrived only to learn that his Conservative government had suffered a staggering defeat. Even the British people themselves were a little surprised at the result. Churchill kept his seat as an MP, but no longer as PM. The new government was led by Clement Attlee, who had been Churchill's deputy in the wartime coalition government. So when the conference reconvened at Potsdam, a new British leader was present. But having been with Churchill at Potsdam till then, Attlee was thoroughly briefed on the issues involved. After the war in Europe was over, many problems came to the surface. Every German serviceman had to be screened. This was both to confirm his true identity and to ensure that he had not been involved in war crimes. All members of the SS were prime suspects, and many tried to disguise themselves. Many people had collaborated with the Nazis. The Allies agreed that they should be dealt with by the authorities in their own countries. A number were Russians who wanted Hitler to rid their country of communism. They knew their fate would be a grim one when they returned home. In the summer of 1945, Germany seemed to have no future. Her cities were shattered. Food was desperately short. The Allies did their best to provide basic rations in order to keep the people above starvation level. Goering had been branded as a traitor by Hitler in the Führer's last days. He had tried to take over the leadership on the grounds that Hitler could no longer exercise control from the isolation of his Berlin bunker. Now, he was arrested in southern Germany and then taken to a detention center. The American scientists had been developing an atomic weapon. Under the supervision of Dr. Robert Oppenheimer and General Groves, the Manhattan Project, as it was codenamed, finally managed to create the weapon. A trial bomb was successfully exploded on the 16th of July, 1945, in the New Mexico desert. More bombs were now constructed. Steps to end the war with Japan now required the urgent attention of the leaders at Potsdam. Japan was presented with an ultimatum to surrender or suffer the consequences. She refused. On the 6th of August, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The 9,000-pound bomb was carried by a single B-29, equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. The casualties in Hiroshima were over 78,000 killed, almost in an instant of time. In Nagasaki, the next bomb killed another 40,000. As many again subsequently died of injuries, burns, and the terrible new disease of the atomic age, radiation poisoning. The most devastating war in history was brought to an end by the most savage weapon known to man.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. General Douglas MacArthur has been appointed the Supreme Allied Commander to receive the Japanese surrender. Great Britain, Russia, and China will be represented by high-ranking officers.
The Emperor Hirohito had decreed that the Potsdam Declaration for surrender must be accepted by his government. The great Allied armada now sailed into Tokyo Bay and dropped anchor. The U.S. battleship Missouri was selected for the ceremony that would finally bring the Second World War to its official end. General MacArthur was to preside over the formal Japanese surrender. His fellow commander Chester Nimitz was also present. After the signing, MacArthur spoke.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
The Second World War had come to an end. A staggering 50 million people had lost their lives. Many millions more had lost their homes, and in some cases, especially the concentration camp survivors, their countries. Those 6 long years of war had left the world in ruins. On the British 2nd Division Memorial at Kohima, there is an inscription. It reads, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today."